Title: They mocked a quiet black woman at the airport until she pulled out her U.S. Senator ID. You know what they say? The most dangerous mistake you can make is underestimating the quiet figure in the corner. And on a seemingly ordinary day at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, two arrogant airline employees learned that lesson the hard way. Their laughter and mockery came to a screeching halt the moment real power revealed itself. Senator Margaret Harris, a 62-year-old retired teacher turned U.S. Senator for Michigan, wasn't one for flashy entrances or entourages. She preferred traveling light, just a simple gray pantsuit, a modest black handbag, and a worn carry-on suitcase. It was how she was raised. Humble beginnings, honest work, and the belief that respect is earned, not demanded. That morning, Margaret was headed to Washington, D.C. for urgent Senate hearings on economic reforms. She'd already hosted a town hall, answered half a dozen calls from colleagues, and barely had enough time to catch her flight. Still, she moved through the airport with quiet grace, never once expecting special treatment, just common courtesy. But sometimes, that's too much to ask. The terminal buzzed with travelers rushing to their gates, but few spared her more than a passing glance. To most, she was just another older black woman traveling alone, perhaps someone's grandmother off to visit family. No one saw the weight she carried, the years of service, the sleepless nights fighting for her state, the authority resting in the ID tucked neatly in her purse. Reaching the Atlantic Wings Airlines check-in counter, Margaret keyed in her reservation. A text from her chief of staff popped up. "Be ready for back-to-back meetings once you land." She sighed, knowing there was no rest waiting for her. Then came the moment that would set the tone for what was to come. At the baggage counter stood Stephen Barnes and Victoria Matthews, two employees barely out of their 20s. Slouching behind the desk, they looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret approached with a polite smile, offering her reservation. "Good afternoon," she greeted warmly. Stephen didn't even glance up. "ID," he barked flatly. Margaret handed over her license without complaint, though she noticed Victoria barely stifling a laugh, her eyes glued to something on her phone. Stephen's lips curled into a smirk. "Huh, first class?" he snorted, exchanging a glance with Victoria, who giggled openly. "That's correct," Margaret replied, her voice steady. Stephen shook his head with thinly veiled amusement. "Must be nice." Victoria chuckled again, not bothering to hide the contempt on her face. They saw an old black woman. They assumed she didn't belong. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the very woman they were mocking had the power to bury their careers with a single phone call. And soon they'd find out. Senator Margaret Harris had faced plenty of disrespect in her career, political rivals trying to diminish her, reporters twisting her words. But this was different. This was being mocked by a couple of 20-something airline employees for daring to fly first class was a new low. Still, she kept her composure. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" she asked evenly, her voice calm but carrying that unmistakable undertone of authority. Stephen Barnes barely glanced at her. No problem," he muttered, but his smirk told a different story. With a huff, he printed the baggage tag and shoved it toward her. "Take your bag to the oversized drop. Over there." He pointed vaguely toward the far end of the counter, making it clear he wouldn't lift a finger to assist further. Behind him, Victoria Matthews stifled another laugh, the sound floating in the air like a taunt. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She grabbed her bag and walked away, reminding herself that courtesy was a two-way street, but some folks simply refused to meet you halfway. For now, she'd let it slide, but deep down a voice whispered, "This isn't over." Dragging her carry-on toward the TSA security checkpoint, Margaret forced herself to focus. She made sure her checked bag was properly tagged before navigating through the winding ropes leading to the X-ray machines. Up ahead, a man was already causing a scene, arguing loudly with TSA officers. She shook her head. Traveling was hard enough without tempers flaring. Thank God for TSA pre-check. As a U.S. Senator, Margaret qualified for every priority boarding and clearance perk there was, but she rarely pulled that card. She believed in walking through the same process as her constituents. It kept her grounded. But today, of all days, she was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she should have taken the VIP lane. She took off her shoes and placed her laptop in a bin when it happened. The snickering. Margaret turned just enough to see Stephen and Victoria entering the security line. Now out of uniform, they looked almost gleeful, chatting and giggling like school kids. What the hell were they doing here? Then she remembered, airline employees sometimes flew as non-revenue passengers to reposition or catch a ride. Figures. She tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. First class, did you see that old carry-on? Victoria sneered, not even whispering. Looks like she got it from Goodwill. Stephen chuckled. The nerve of some people. Bet she scammed some upgrade. Right? She sure doesn't look like she belongs in first class, Victoria snickered. Margaret's stomach nodded. That hit different. This wasn't just mocking. They were talking about her. Loud enough for others to hear. Loud enough to humiliate. For a split second, she wanted to spin around and put them in their place. But no, she'd been through worse. She was a U.S. Senator, damn it. If she'd survived Congress, she could survive two mouthy kids. Pick your battles, her father's voice echoed in her mind. But when it's time, make sure they remember your name. Margaret exhaled slowly, willing the anger down as she collected her belongings from the scanner. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. After clearing security, she glanced at her boarding pass. Gate 8, Atlantic Wings Flight 4321 to Washington National Airport. She had some time. Maybe a coffee would help calm her nerves. The airport was alive. Families hustling toward gates, business travelers glued to their phones, kids whining about snacks. Margaret found a small cafe near her gate, ordered a latte, and settled into a corner booth. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, flipping through notes for the upcoming hearing on economic reforms. It was a cause that mattered deeply. Small businesses in low-income neighborhoods were barely staying afloat. She knew that pain. She'd grown up watching her parents fight tooth and nail to keep their Detroit auto shop alive. She was halfway through highlighting her speech notes when a soft voice interrupted. "Excuse me, ma'am. May I have a word?" Margaret looked up to see a woman in an Atlantic Wings Airlines uniform, older, maybe mid-50s, with a kind face. Her name tag read Carol. "Of course," Margaret replied, standing automatically. Carol leaned in, lowering her voice. I just wanted to apologize, ma'am. I don't know exactly what happened back there, but I saw Stephen and Victoria giggling, whispering, pointing. It didn't sit right. For the first time since this mess started, Margaret felt a flicker of gratitude. "Thank you for saying that." Carol glanced around, making sure no one overheard. They've done this before. Act professional when the boss is around. But the second they're unsupervised, rude as hell. "You didn't deserve that, ma'am." Margaret smiled, her voice warm but measured. "It's all right. I've learned not everyone's going to treat you right, especially when they think you're nobody." Carol shook her head. "That's the thing. You could be anyone. That's no way to treat a paying passenger." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of Carol's words. "Thank you for saying something. Most people wouldn't." "If you need anything," Carol added, "I'll be near gate 8. With that, Carol disappeared into the crowd, leaving Margaret staring after her. There were still good people in the world, but Carol's warning felt like a storm cloud on the horizon. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Margaret glanced down at her coffee, now lukewarm, and took a sip. Her mind churned. Stephen and Victoria weren't done. They'd crossed a line, and something told her they'd try again. Maybe not here, maybe not now, but they weren't finished. The senator straightened her shoulders. Let them try. They'd find out soon enough who she really was. Margaret Harris felt a flicker of gratitude and no small amount of surprise when Carol approached her at the cafe. In her experience, bystanders rarely spoke up. "Thank you," Margaret smiled warmly. "I appreciate that. I did sense some unprofessional behavior. I was hoping maybe I was just being overly sensitive." Carol shook her head firmly. "No, ma'am, it wasn't just you. We've had complaints about those two before. I don't have direct authority over them, but I couldn't just stand by. If you need anything, I'm stationed near gate 8. You come find me." Touched by Carol's sincerity, Margaret felt a weight lift. Just a little. "That's very kind of you. I'm all right for now, but if anything else happens, I'll be sure to seek you out." With a sympathetic nod, Carol disappeared back into the crowd. Margaret sank deeper into her seat, clutching her coffee like a lifeline. It was a small relief to know not everyone at Atlantic Wings Airlines was cut from the same cloth as Stephen and Victoria. Still, Carol's quiet warning stayed with her like a shadow. Her gut told her this wasn't over. Taking a deep breath, Margaret tried to push the worry aside and focus on her Senate hearing notes. But where there should have been calm, there was now a thread of unease pulling at the edges of her concentration. About 20 minutes later, Margaret made her way toward Gate 8. The waiting area was packed. Families chasing restless toddlers, business travelers hammering away at laptops, and tourists sprawled over seats with their suitcases acting as footrests. Overhead screens displayed departures to cities across the country, but Margaret's eyes landed squarely on Flight 4321 to Washington National Airport, boarding in 30 minutes. She spotted a seat near the window and settled in, leafing through her talking points for the committee hearing. Across the aisle, a young mother bounced her fussy toddler on her lap, while two men in tailored suits debated stock market trends with animated hand gestures. Margaret took it all in with a small, knowing smile. Every person here had their own story, their own battles. That was one thing politics had taught her. Everyone carried something heavy. But then, like clockwork, the calm was shattered. Stephen Barnes and Victoria Matthews appeared at the boarding podium. Margaret's stomach twisted into a tight knot. Of course, out of all the gate agents in the airport, it had to be them. From her vantage point, she watched as Stephen pecked at the computer keys half-heartedly, while Victoria leaned in, whispering something that earned a crooked grin. Every few seconds, they'd scan the crowd, their bored expressions barely masked behind forced professionalism. Margaret stiffened when their eyes landed on her. Stephen elbowed Victoria and nodded toward her. Victoria rolled her eyes, then turned back to the screen with a smirk. The message was clear. They knew exactly where she was, and they weren't done. Margaret forced herself to remain still, pretending to study her notes. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she drew on years of political training. Never show them fear. Part of her wanted to march over there and set them straight. But no, not yet. She'd learned patience. She'd wait for their next move. Minutes ticked by like hours. Suddenly, the loudspeaker crackled to life. Stephen's bored voice boomed over the gate area. Attention passengers on Atlantic Wings Flight 4321 to Washington National Airport. We will begin pre-boarding shortly for passengers needing extra time, families with small children, and active military personnel. Margaret stayed seated, hands folded neatly in her lap. She knew the drill. She wasn't about to rush. Still, a gnawing unease crept up her spine. From the corner of her eye, she caught Victoria smirking in her direction again. She was next to board when first class was called, and somehow she knew they were going to try something. Before the announcement came, a polite tap startled her. Margaret turned to find a weary traveler gesturing toward the seat beside her, the one she'd used for her briefcase. "Ma'am, is this seat taken?" "Of course not," Margaret smiled, moving her briefcase onto her lap. The man settled in, nodding gratefully. Margaret tucked her phone, wallet, and boarding pass securely in her purse, her mind steeling for what was to come. Every second that passed felt like the tightening of a noose. She knew what game Stephen and Victoria were playing. She'd seen it before. People drunk on a tiny bit of power, itching for someone they could look down on. This was it. Margaret glanced at the clock overhead. 10 minutes to boarding. The area around Gate 8 buzzed as pre-boarding began. Parents herding kids, passengers juggling bags and drinks. Margaret stood, leaning against the window, quietly reviewing her notes, though the words blurred. She couldn't stop watching Stephen and Victoria. Stephen slouched behind the counter, taking questions with the enthusiasm of a teenager forced to work summer break. Victoria's attention was split between her phone and tossing sideways glances toward Margaret. Every so often, they'd huddle together, whispering and laughing. Twice, Margaret caught Victoria flat out staring at her with that same condescending grin. It was taking every ounce of Margaret's restraint not to confront them. But she didn't rise. Not yet. She'd spent a lifetime sitting through combative debates and brutal campaigns. This was just another battlefield. Suddenly, the PA system clicked back on. "We will now begin boarding for first-class passengers and platinum members on Flight 4321 to Washington National." Margaret inhaled slowly. Here we go. She rose, adjusting her blazer, and took her place in the first-class line. There were only a few ahead of her, an older couple with matching windbreakers and a man juggling two cell phones. Victoria's eyes locked onto her instantly. Margaret didn't flinch. As the older couple's passes were scanned without issue, Margaret heard Victoria murmur something to Stephen, who chuckled. The tension in the air was palpable. Passengers could feel it too. Eyes started darting back and forth. The couple moved forward. Now it was Margaret's turn. Victoria took her boarding pass slowly, staring at it like it was forged from counterfeit gold. "Miss Harris, is it?" "That's correct," Margaret replied, voice steady. "First class." "Huh," Victoria muttered, loud enough for the people behind to hear. Stephen leaned over the monitor, pretending to double-check something. "That's interesting." Margaret stood her ground, face unreadable. Victoria tapped the screen unnecessarily, dragging out the moment. "We just need to confirm this wasn't a mileage upgrade or anything like that. Happens all the time." Margaret's jaw tensed. "I purchased this seat. Full fare. You have that in your system." Stephen snorted. "Yeah, we should, but things get missed." The businessman behind Margaret shifted uncomfortably, sensing the scene. Margaret held her tongue. She knew what was happening. This wasn't about a boarding pass. This was about who they thought belonged in first class. Victoria's smirk widened. "All right then. Welcome aboard," she drawled, handing back the pass like it disgusted her to touch it. Margaret took it slowly, locking eyes with Victoria. She said quietly, "you really ought to be careful who you underestimate." And with that, she walked down the jet bridge, head high, heart pounding. They had no idea what was coming next. Standing there in her usual understated but professional attire, Senator Margaret Harris felt like a target, singled out by people who knew absolutely nothing about her. All they saw was a black woman traveling alone. They couldn't imagine the weight of the title she carried or the battles she'd fought. The loudspeaker crackled, pulling her from her thoughts. Stephen Barnes's monotone voice rang out. "Passengers requiring extra time or traveling with small children may now board." Margaret exhaled slowly, watching as frazzled mothers, fathers, and toddlers shuffled toward the jet bridge. She knew what was next, and she dreaded it. It was finally time to face Stephen and Victoria again. Sure enough, as the families finished boarding, Stephen cleared his throat, tapping the mic lazily. "We will now begin boarding for our first-class passengers and executive platinum members on Atlantic Wings Flight 4321 to Washington National." Beside him, Victoria Matthews stood stiff, scanning the crowd like a predator looking for prey. Her eyes landed on Margaret instantly, narrowing, almost daring her to step forward. Margaret gathered her carry-on, rose with the dignity of a woman who had weathered storms far worse than this, and took her place in the short first-class line. She was fourth, behind an elderly couple in matching beige windbreakers and a harried businessman juggling two smartphones. It was a small queue, expected for a midday flight. As the line edged forward, Margaret could already hear the whispers. Their whispers. "Oh, look who's here," Victoria sneered under her breath, her voice carrying just enough for Margaret to catch. Stephen snickered in reply, loud enough that even the elderly couple turned to glance back. They sensed the tension, but wisely said nothing and proceeded through. Stephen and Victoria scanned the couple's boarding passes with disinterested nods. No problem there. Then the businessman, quick, efficient, done. Finally, it was Margaret's turn. Victoria snatched the boarding pass from Margaret's hand, holding it up like she expected it to disintegrate. Her eyes flicked across the screen with exaggerated scrutiny. Meanwhile, Stephen craned his neck, giving Margaret a once-over, his expression a mix of smugness and disbelief. "Miss Harris, is it?" Victoria asked, arching a perfectly plucked brow. "That's correct," Margaret replied, her voice steady and calm. "First-class seat. I see." Victoria let the words hang, dripping with sarcasm, as if the very idea was laughable. "Yes," Margaret repeated, refusing to rise to the bait. She'd bought that ticket fair and square, just like anyone else who valued comfort and privacy to get some work done. Stephen made a show of tapping something on his screen. "Huh, that's interesting." He leaned in closer to Victoria, but his voice was deliberately loud enough for Margaret to hear. "We should be careful. Wouldn't want anyone slipping into first class who doesn't belong." That did it. Margaret's anger flared white hot, but she clung to her composure. "Is there a problem with my reservation?" Her voice was clipped, icy. For a moment, Victoria hesitated. Maybe even she realized they'd pushed too far. but then that fake, patronizing smile returned. "No problem, Miss Harris," Victoria cooed. "Just need to confirm you purchased this seat, not upgraded with miles you don't have or some other arrangement." A flicker of confusion crossed Margaret's face. "Excuse me? I booked this with my frequent flyer account. Paid the difference for first class. Should be right there in your records." Stephen shrugged lazily. "We see this all the time. Folks trying to sneak upgrades." Victoria giggled, waving the boarding pass dismissively. "I'm sure it's fine, but you'd be surprised how many people try to pull one over." Stephen leaned in again, his grin oily. "Gotta watch out for those free riders." He emphasized the words like a curse, letting them hang heavy in the air. The businessman behind Margaret cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably at the spectacle. But Stephen and Victoria didn't care. Their eyes were locked on Margaret, their target. The elderly couple who had already boarded lingered a few steps away, pretending not to eavesdrop but clearly curious. Margaret inhaled deeply, her father's voice echoing in her mind. "Hold your head high. Never let him see you sweat." She straightened her shoulders. "I assure you, there's no free riding here." Victoria smirked, handing the boarding pass back with a slow, theatrical flourish. "Well, by all means, enjoy your flight," she drawled, making it sound anything but sincere. Margaret took the pass calmly, her gaze unwavering. Without another word, she gripped her carry-on and stepped forward. She could have snapped, could have dragged out her Senate ID right there and dropped it on the counter like a bomb. But no, not yet. There was a time and place, and she had a feeling they'd give her the perfect opportunity. As she walked down the jet bridge, Margaret's stomach churned with frustration. How many times had she faced this? The subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways people tried to put her in her place because of how she looked, not who she was. But this time, they picked the wrong woman. The weight of Washington, D.C. pulled at her. Important committee meetings, economic reform hearings, real work was waiting. She didn't have the luxury of being sidetracked by petty, small-minded people. Still, she promised herself, if they keep pushing, I won't hesitate to stand my ground, no matter the case. As Margaret Harris stepped onto the aircraft, a flight attendant named Tony greeted her warmly at the door. "Welcome aboard, ma'am," he smiled, his tone kind and professional. For the first time that day, Margaret felt a small measure of relief, proof that not everyone shared Stephen's and Victoria's contempt. She nodded politely and made her way into the spacious first-class cabin of the Atlantic Wings Boeing 737. The plush, oversized seats offered some comfort, at least physically. Margaret found her spot at 2A and carefully stowed her carry-on overhead. She sat, glancing out of the window as her phone buzzed with staff messages. Still, she took a moment to compose herself, but the sting of what had just happened at the gate lingered. Tony reappeared by her side. "Good afternoon, ma'am. May I offer you a drink before takeoff? We have water, juice, or champagne." Margaret managed a polite smile, appreciating the man's kindness. "Water, please, just water." "Absolutely." Tony returned moments later with a chilled bottle of water and a plastic cup. "Here you go, ma'am." "Thank you, Tony." Margaret nodded, grateful, if only briefly, to be treated like any other passenger. Other travelers filed into first class, familiar faces from the gate, business folks, a couple on vacation, a mother rocking a sleeping infant. Margaret settled in, hoping the ordeal was behind her, but it wasn't. Her stomach dropped the moment she spotted them, Stephen Barnes and Victoria Matthews, stepping into the first-class cabin. She blinked twice. What the hell were they doing here? Gate agents rarely boarded unless something was wrong. Yet there they were, marching straight toward Tony, their faces set with determination. Margaret kept her eyes forward, pretending to scroll through her phone, but her peripheral vision caught every move. Victoria leaned in close to Tony, her voice low but her gestures animated. Tony frowned, his eyes flickering toward Margaret's seat, toward her. Behind Victoria, Stephen stood rigid, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Tony held up a hand trying to calm Victoria down, but she just kept talking. Her tone grew sharper, more insistent. Finally, after a tense moment, Tony nodded reluctantly. Margaret's pulse quickened. Tony approached quietly, but even with his soft voice, every nearby passenger could hear him. "Miss Harris?" She looked up slowly, meeting his apologetic gaze. "Yes?" Tony glanced back at Stephen and Victoria, then leaned in. I'm really sorry about this, ma'am, but They're requesting to re-verify your boarding pass. They're claiming there's an error on the manifest. Margaret's eyes narrowed, disbelief flashing across her face. I already showed it at the gate. Why is this being questioned again? Tony's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. I know, ma'am, I understand, but they're insisting may I see it? Just once more, please. Jaw tight, Margaret pulled up her digital boarding pass from her phone's wallet app and handed it over. Tony scanned it with his handheld device. The scanner beeped almost immediately, a perfect match. Tony exhaled in relief. C2A is confirmed. No errors. Margaret caught this briefest flicker of shame on Tony's face as he turned back toward Stephen and Victoria. She's fine, he called, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. Seat confirmed. But Victoria's narrowed eyes stayed locked on Margaret, and Stephen just shook his head slowly, unconvinced. They exchanged another hushed comment, no apology, no retreat, then lingered awkwardly in the aisle. Margaret's hands balled into fists in her lap. Every muscle in her body was tense, screaming for her to stand up and demand respect. She had done nothing wrong, nothing to warrant this level of scrutiny. Across the cabin, passengers began whispering. Glances shot her way. She could almost hear what they were thinking. What did she do? Why are they targeting her? An older flight attendant, her name tag reading Linda, approached cautiously. Is there a situation? She asked Victoria quietly. Victoria waved her off, muttering something about just checking on a manifest issue. Margaret's jaw clenched. She could feel the weight of every stare, the hot burn of injustice creeping up her neck. She'd faced this before, too many times, the unspoken microaggressions, the constant assumptions. But this wasn't subtle. It was blatant, public humiliation. The logical part of her brain whispered, pull out your Senate ID, end this now. But another voice, stubborn, tired, fought back. Why should I have to prove my worth to them? Why isn't being a paying passenger enough? Finally, with a heavy sigh, the plane door thudded shut. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, welcoming everyone to Atlantic Wings Flight 4321 to Washington National. Estimated flight time is 1 hour and 45 minutes, folks. Sit back and relax. Margaret wanted to laugh at the irony. Stephen and Victoria exchanged one last look, one last smirk, before finally turning to leave. But not before Victoria shot Margaret a final glare, shaking her head like she couldn't believe Margaret had made it this far. Stephen leaned in, whispered something crude, and both of them chuckled as they disappeared down the aisle. Margaret sat frozen, fury simmering just beneath her skin. She turned her head toward the window, eyes tracing the rows of planes parked across the airfield, each carrying their own stories, their own passengers with families, youngs, dreams. Wasn't the job of the airline to make sure every passenger had a smooth, respectful experience? Not to single them out, not to judge them. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat heavy. If she let this go, they'd think it was okay. If she made a scene, the story would be twisted. Angry black woman causes problem on plane. Margaret closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Not yet, but soon. Linda and Tony moved down the aisle performing the safety demonstration. Their faces tense, likely embarrassed by the scene their own coworkers had caused. Margaret forced herself to listen, trying to focus on anything but the searing anger building inside her. No matter what came next, she knew one thing. They picked the wrong woman to mess with. Margaret forced herself to focus on the safety demonstration, gripping the armrest tightly, her breath steadying as adrenaline still surged through her veins. Once I get to D.C., she reminded herself, I'll deal with real battles, the legislative ones. Still, a part of her knew, if Stephen or Victoria dared push her again, she wouldn't stay silent. Sometimes the best way to handle injustice wasn't walking away. It was standing tall and showing them exactly who they were messing with. 30 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime. Tony and Linda began first-class service, rolling the cart down the aisle, offering drinks and small plates. Margaret normally welcomed this moment, the peaceful routine of a flight, reviewing her notes, maybe enjoying a snack. But not today. Her nerves were still on edge, the images of Victoria's sneer and Stephen's smug grin replaying in her mind like a broken record. She unlocked her phone, now in airplane mode, and skimmed the message from Vanessa, her chief of staff. New economic data just came in. We'll need to pivot your opening statement. Margaret tried to dive into the numbers, seeking refuge in the work. But before she could fully absorb the data, a chime broke the air again. "Tony, please report to the forward galley," came Linda's shaky voice over the intercom. There was a tremor there Margaret didn't miss. Tony excused himself, pushing the cart aside. Margaret's instincts flared. Discreetly, she turned just enough to see. Up near the galley, Linda looked pale, her eyes darting nervously. Standing beside her, shockingly, were Stephen Barnes and Victoria Matthews. How the hell are they still on this plane? Margaret's heart pounded. Gate agents didn't stay on board. Had they snuck on as non-rev staff? Either way, this was beyond irregular. It was intentional. She couldn't hear it all, but a few words made it to her ears. "She's definitely not who she claims," Victoria spat, her voice icy. "There's no record of her booking that seat." "She's got fake credentials or something," Stephen added smugly. Tony's brows furrowed deep in confusion, his head shaking. Linda tried calming them, whispering fiercely, but they weren't backing down. Margaret's chest burned. Enough is enough. Without waiting another second, she unbuckled her seatbelt, ignoring the wide-eyed passengers watching. She strode up the aisle, head high, fury simmering just beneath her calm exterior. Tony spotted her and looked relieved. Victoria stiffened immediately. "Is there a problem?" Margaret asked, her tone firm, sharp enough to cut glass. Victoria crossed her arms, chin raised. "We have reason to believe your documentation is fraudulent." She flipped her phone screen toward Tony. "There's no record of a Margaret Harris of her background paying for a first-class seat." That word, background, hung there, ugly and obvious. Stephen piled on, smirking. "Why don't you just come clean, ma'am? How did you get that seat?" Margaret felt her entire body shake, not with fear, but with a rage so deep it threatened to explode. In all her years, she had never been treated like this on a plane. Tony stepped forward, hands raised. "We already scanned her boarding pass. It's valid," Victoria sneered, waving him off. "You can scan anything if it's stolen or fake. We want to see her ID. Now." Margaret's pulse roared in her ears. She could flash her driver's license, keep it simple. But no, they'd crossed every line. There was only one way to end this. Jaw set, she reached into her purse, past her wallet, past her phone, until her fingers found the soft leather case that rarely left her side. She pulled it out slowly, letting the moment hang. "This is what you want?" she asked, her voice calm, but vibrating with contained fury. She flipped it open, revealing the official seal of the United States Senate gleaming under the cabin lights. "I am Senator Margaret Harris of Michigan," she said slowly, so every soul in that galley heard it clear. "This is my identification." Stunned silence. The air itself seemed to freeze. Victoria's face drained of color, her mouth opening but no sound escaping. The smirk was gone. Stephen's jaw slackened, his eyes darting between the badge and Margaret's face. Sheer disbelief painted across his features. Tony took a cautious step forward, peeking at the ID. His face paled, then shifted to something else, respect. Linda gasped softly, covering her mouth. Margaret wasn't done. "You harassed me the moment I checked in. You accused me of lying, of fraud. You targeted me based on your own biases, your own assumptions. And now that you know exactly who I am, would you care to explain yourselves?" Victoria stammered, unable to form a sentence. Stephen swallowed hard, voice barely a whisper. We didn't know." Margaret's eyes flashed. "No, you didn't, and that's the problem. You didn't know, so you treated me with open contempt. That says everything." Tony finally found his voice. "Senator, I'm so sorry this happened. We value your patronage, your presence. You shouldn't have been treated this way. No passenger should. I'll be informing the captain immediately." Victoria stood frozen, pale as a sheet. Stephen kept his head down, silent. Margaret took a step back, sliding her ID away. "Good, you do that." The galley stayed silent as a tomb. Margaret knew every passenger in first class was watching, but she no longer cared. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about accountability. She returned to her seat, sitting tall. Her heart still pounded, but for the first time that day, she felt in control. Whatever came next, Stephen and Victoria had just made the worst mistake of their careers. Tony stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment as he studied the U.S. Senate ID still glinting in the cabin light. The authenticity was undeniable. His voice was gentle, but thick with regret. "Senator Harris," he said softly, I am so sorry this happened on my flight. We value your patronage, and frankly, we want every passenger to feel safe and respected. I'll need to inform the captain about this immediately." Victoria Matthews stood frozen, cheeks flushed crimson. Stephen Barnes swallowed hard, staring at the floor, his cocky arrogance nowhere to be found. Linda lingered nearby, uncertain how to defuse the disaster unfolding in front of her. Margaret slipped her Senate ID back into her purse. Her tone was unwavering, sharp and final. "Yes, please inform the captain. And when we land, I expect to speak directly with a senior manager from Atlantic Wings Airlines. This isn't over." Tony nodded stiffly, his eyes brimming with a need to make things right. "Understood, Senator." With that, Tony turned and hurried down the aisle toward the cockpit, leaving behind a tense and awkward silence. Victoria and Stephen stood rooted in place, exchanging frantic whispers now. The smugness, the cruelty, all of it had vanished like morning fog burned off by the sun. Margaret watched them for a beat, the anger still simmering just below her polished exterior. She could almost hear her father's voice, steady and calm from years past. "Stay poised. Power is in the patience." And so she did. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, some whispering softly as pieces of the situation fell into place. Others stared openly now, eyes flicking between Margaret and the two trembling agents. Her name, Senator Harris, now spoken aloud, had begun rippling through the rows. Margaret stood in the galley, feeling the weight of it all, but also the quiet power of taking a stand. Finally, Tony reappeared, motioning to her. "Senator Harris, the captain would like a word, if you don't mind." She nodded once, head high, and followed Tony toward the narrow forward galley. As she passed Victoria and Stephen, she caught the barest glimpse of shame flickering across their faces. But she felt no sympathy. Not now. There, waiting in full uniform, stood Captain Rose Hernandez. Every inch the picture of authority and control. Her jaw was set, but her eyes were apologetic. "Senator Harris," Captain Hernandez began quietly, "I've just been briefed on the situation. Please, let me start by offering my sincerest apology on behalf of Atlantic Wings Airlines. This is completely unacceptable. We pride ourselves on treating every passenger with dignity, and frankly, you should never have been subjected to this." Margaret raised a steady hand. "Captain, I appreciate the immediate attention, but let me be very clear. This is no longer about me. Victoria and Stephen harassed me repeatedly, not just once. Whether I'm a senator or a school teacher is irrelevant. No passenger should endure that sort of behavior. Ever." Captain Hernandez's face hardened with resolve. "I agree, ma'am. 100%. I've already contacted our operations team. A senior representative will meet you the moment we land. I promise you, this will be handled." Just then, the plane jolted with sudden turbulence, almost punctuating the moment. Margaret braced against the galley's counter, then nodded. "Thank you, Captain. I'll return to my seat now." As she walked back through the aisle, she felt the eyes, all of them. Some stared with pity, others with respect, a few with outright curiosity. She could see the whispers forming like a ripple in water. There was still an hour left before they landed in Washington, D.C., but the tone of the flight had shifted. Margaret had drawn a line, and everyone knew it. Tony reappeared quietly by her seat. "Senator, I know you've been through enough already, but Victoria and Stephen, they're insisting on offering you an apology. Would you allow that?" Margaret stiffened. A part of her wanted to tell them to hell with it, but another part, the public servant, the seasoned politician, knew this was the moment to navigate with grace. She sighed. "All right, they can come, but let me be clear, I'm not in the mood for excuses." Tony nodded gratefully and disappeared. Moments later, Victoria and Stephen approached, looking like two children summoned to the principal's office. Gone was the arrogance, the smirks, the cruel laughter. Instead, both stood awkwardly, shifting their weight. Victoria opened her mouth first, but nothing came out. She faltered, then closed it again. Stephen cleared his throat. "Senator Harris, we're really sorry about the misunderstanding. There were, irregularities in the passenger manifest. Victoria jumped in quickly, her voice trembling. We didn't mean any harm, ma'am. We thought someone was using a fake identity to get a free upgrade. It happens sometimes, you know. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. So you immediately assumed I was the fraud. Victoria paled. No, we didn't recognize you. And your seat assignment flagged weird. That's all. Margaret inhaled slowly. She'd heard 1,000 half-baked excuses in her political career, but this was one of the worst. I've dealt with a lot of excuses, she said coldly. But what you did wasn't about the manifest or some system glitch. It was about me, the way I look, the assumptions you made the second you saw me. Victoria's lips quivered. We're truly sorry. Stephen could barely meet her eyes. We were wrong. Margaret sat silent for a moment, letting their words hang awkwardly in the air. Finally, she nodded. I accept your apology, but understand this. You don't just owe it to me. You owe it to every passenger who walks through that gate. The ones who don't have a Senate badge to flash. The ones you judge just because they don't fit your idea of who belongs in first class. Both nodded quickly, mumbling thanks, then retreated like scolded children. Margaret exhaled. The immediate battle was over, but the real reckoning was still coming, and it was waiting on the ground. Whether or not you recognize me shouldn't matter, Senator Margaret Harris said coldly, her voice slicing through the silence. Every passenger deserves the presumption of honesty, especially after presenting valid credentials at check-in, the gate, and again on board. Stephen Barnes grimaced, shame painting his face. I know, we messed up. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Yes, she replied curtly, you did. Victoria Matthews looked on the verge of tears. Whether it was genuine remorse or just the humiliation of being caught, Margaret couldn't tell, and frankly, she didn't care. We truly are sorry, Victoria whispered, voice trembling. We didn't know you were... Margaret's eyes narrowed. A senator? She finished the sentence for her, sharp, unforgiving. Does that make me more worthy of respect? Or is it just the shock that you offended someone important? Neither had an answer. Both stood frozen, eyes wide, mouths opening and closing like fish gasping for air. Finally, Margaret drew in a deep breath, holding their gaze. If you're truly sorry, I suggest you take a hard look at your assumptions. I accept your apology on the condition that your behavior changes, not just toward me, but toward any passenger who might look different than you expect. They mumbled their gratitude, weak broken words, before slinking away like scolded children. Margaret exhaled slowly and sank back into her seat. The tension in her shoulders finally began to loosen, but the fight wasn't over. The real reckoning was waiting for them on the ground. She'd made her point, but accountability was non-negotiable. The remainder of the flight was subdued, yet the cabin practically buzzed with quiet gossip. Margaret could feel it. Nearly every first-class passenger now knew exactly who she was. Word likely trickled back to coach as well. Still, to their credit, Tony and Linda remained professional. Each time they passed, their faces carried quiet apologies. Drinks were offered, meals served, but the air remained heavy. As the plane began its descent, Captain Hernandez's voice crackled over the speaker system. Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten seatbelts. We're beginning our final approach into Washington National. Margaret glanced out the window, spotting the familiar sprawl of the Washington, D.C. metro area below. No matter how many times she flew in, the sight carried weight. This was where she fought for her constituents, where real power was earned. The landing was smooth, the tires kissing the runway at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. A wave of relief swept over her, but there was no time to relax. She had a full committee schedule ahead. Still, one thing mattered first, ensuring the airline took her complaint seriously. As the plane taxied to the gate, Margaret's phone buzzed with messages. The seatbelt sign hadn't even flicked off before she saw a text from Vanessa. Senator, heard there was an incident. Media inquiries already swirling. Are you okay? Margaret sighed. News traveled fast. Someone, perhaps a passenger, must have tipped off a reporter or posted something online. She could practically see the headlines forming. Passengers in economy began filing out. Just then, Tony reappeared, his voice soft. Senator Harris, we have a corporate manager waiting at the jet bridge. She'd like to speak with you privately. Margaret nodded. She gathered her briefcase, rising steadily. Neither Stephen nor Victoria was anywhere to be seen, likely hiding in the galley or slipping off the plane to avoid further humiliation. Linda offered a small, supportive smile as Margaret passed. She appreciated it more than she let on. Stepping off the aircraft, Margaret immediately spotted the woman waiting for her. A crisp navy suit, Atlantic Wings Airlines logo on her lapel. Rachel Smith, her name tag read. Senator Harris, Rachel greeted, voice tight with concern as she extended her hand. I'm here to address what happened on your flight. Margaret shook the offered hand, forcing her frustration down. I appreciate you meeting me. We need to talk about what happened and how Atlantic Wings plans to handle it. Rachel nodded, motioning her toward a quiet seating area away from the stream of deplaning passengers. Once seated, Rachel pulled out a tablet, ready to document every word. First and foremost, Senator Harris, on behalf of Atlantic Wings Airlines, I extend our sincere apology. No passenger, least of all someone of your stature, should endure what you did. We strive for professionalism and inclusion, and I'm disheartened this happened. Margaret appreciated the direct acknowledgement. Thank you, but you need to understand, an apology is just the beginning. She leaned forward, her tone firm. Victoria Matthews and Stephen Barnes harassed me. Repeatedly. They questioned my legitimacy, mocked my presence in first class, and only backed down when I presented my Senate ID. That's not just unprofessional, it's discriminatory. Rachel sighed, tapping notes quickly. I've already reviewed the captain's preliminary report. He flagged the incident immediately. May I ask, Senator, are you looking to file a formal complaint, or is legal action something you're considering? Margaret's jaw tightened. I am filing a formal complaint, and I expect disciplinary action. If this is how your staff treats passengers they don't recognize, how many others have been subjected to this without the means or platform to fight back? Rachel nodded solemnly. I understand. This is serious, Senator Harris. The crew is grounded pending an internal review. Depending on the findings, suspension or termination is possible. Margaret's eyes didn't waver. Good, because titles shouldn't be the only thing protecting someone from abuse. Today it was me, but next time it could be someone without a badge, without a name, and they'll have no way to defend themselves. Rachel's expression softened. You're absolutely right, Senator. We've failed here. I'll personally oversee the investigation. Margaret sat back, the weight of the day heavy on her shoulders. Make sure you do, because I won't let this get buried. Rachel hesitated, then added, Senator, if you're open to it, we'd like to discuss ways you could help us improve our bias and discrimination training. Your perspective, it could help prevent this from ever happening again. Margaret blinked, surprised by the offer, but gave a slow nod. We'll talk after your investigation. But know this, if your findings sweep this under the rug, you'll see me again, at the highest level. Rachel stood, offering her hand once more. I understand, and thank you, Senator Harris. As Margaret walked away, she knew the firestorm wasn't over, but she'd made sure it wouldn't be forgotten. The real fight for accountability was just beginning. Rachel's expression remained professional, though Senator Margaret Harris could see flickers of tension around her eyes. I understand, Senator, Rachel finally said. We're taking this very seriously. Victoria Matthews and Stephen Barnes will be placed on immediate suspension while we conduct a thorough investigation. If they're found responsible for violating our code of conduct, especially regarding discrimination, they could be terminated. Margaret let that sink in. She wasn't out for blood, but she knew that real change required real consequences. I hope the investigation is swift and fair, Margaret said firmly. Yes, I'm a public figure, but no passenger, senator or not, should endure what I went through. I've lived with racial bias my whole life. I'm not about to let it slide without accountability. Rachel nodded. Absolutely, Senator Harris. I'll escalate this directly to our Vice President of Customer Experience. Additionally, as part of our remediation, we'd like to offer you a complimentary round-trip ticket on Atlantic Wings Airlines or a full refund for today's travel. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. I'm not here for freebies. What I want is culture change. I want to know that the next time someone who doesn't look like they belong in first class, they won't be treated like a criminal." Rachel's expression grew solemn. "That's our goal too, Senator. You have my word. I'll keep you updated throughout the investigation. But in the meantime, please accept our deepest apologies. This matter is being addressed at the highest levels." With that, Margaret concluded the meeting. She had a full schedule waiting back on Capitol Hill, but she knew this issue was far from over. Victoria and Stephen's fates were now sealed, and the airline's reputation hung in the balance. As she left the terminal, Margaret's phone buzzed furiously. Media inquiries had exploded. It was no longer a quiet incident. By the time she reached the Hart Senate office building, Vanessa was already waiting outside, her face lined with urgency. "Senator, it's all over the news. CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, they're all asking for statements. It's trending on social media." Margaret exhaled slowly, already feeling the weight of the spotlight. She had hoped to handle this quietly, but in the age of social media, privacy was a luxury no one could afford. "All right, let's be strategic about this," she said briskly. "Set up a short press briefing after my committee hearing. I'm not letting this overshadow the economic policies I'm fighting for, but I'll address it." Vanessa nodded. "Understood. But the hearing on economic reform starts in 20 minutes. You'll need to lead with strength." Margaret forced a small smile. "I always do." She strode through the marble halls of the Senate building, acutely aware of the dual roles she now juggled. Senator in the face of a growing national conversation about discrimination in air travel. Margaret delivered her opening remarks flawlessly, her voice unwavering as she fought for stronger economic support for small businesses, especially in struggling communities like the one she grew up in back in Detroit. But the moment the hearing adjourned, the press descended. Microphones, cameras, and reporters crowding the hallway. "Senator Harris," one called out, "is it true you were harassed by airline staff?" "Senator, did you really have to show your Senate ID just to prove you belonged in first class? Are you planning to sue Atlantic Wings Airlines?" Margaret raised her hand, her voice calm but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'll make this simple. Yesterday, I was subjected to an incident of bias by 2 Atlantic Wings employees. They singled me out and questioned my right to be in first class based solely on assumptions rooted in prejudice." The crowd of reporters fell silent, hanging on her every word. "While I'm disappointed, I'm not surprised," Margaret continued. "Racial bias is real. It exists in boardrooms, neighborhoods, and yes, even at 35,000 feet. I've filed a formal complaint, and I have faith that Atlantic Wings leadership will investigate and take appropriate action." She paused, locking eyes with several cameras. "My focus remains unchanged, ensuring that every passenger, regardless of race, status, or background, can travel without facing discrimination." Questions flew at her, but Margaret kept her responses sharp and concise. She wasn't about to let the airline incident derail her legislative mission, but she understood the weight of this moment. By shining a light on what happened, she could spark a broader conversation. A conversation about the quiet indignities countless Americans faced without the platform she had. As she stepped away from the press scrum, her phone buzzed again. It was an email from Rachel Smith. "Senator Harris, I wanted to personally update you. Victoria Matthews and Stephen Barnes have been suspended pending our investigation. I will keep you informed every step of the way." Margaret allowed herself a small nod. Karma had a way of coming fast. Still, she knew this was only the first step toward true accountability. 2 days later, the headlines were everywhere. Atlantic Wings employees suspended after harassing Black U.S. Senator pundits on TV debated whether the staff's actions were personal bias or symptoms of systemic issues plaguing the airline industry. Some tried to downplay it. Others demanded sweeping reforms. Through it all, Margaret stayed focused, keeping her head down, her eyes on the bigger picture. Legislative work continued, but she kept one eye trained on the airline's next move. Late that afternoon, her phone rang again. It was Rachel Smith. "Senator Harris, I have important updates." Margaret's voice was cool. "Go ahead." "Our internal investigation found that both Victoria Matthews and Stephen Barnes have a history of unprofessional conduct. Several prior complaints had been filed. Rudeness, inappropriate remarks, and worse." Margaret's jaw tightened. "So this wasn't a one-time lapse?" "No, ma'am," Rachel admitted. Their behavior toward you, it crossed every line. After reviewing all evidence and corroborating crew statements, Atlantic Wings has made a decision. And, Margaret pressed, they've both been terminated, Senator, effective immediately. Margaret sat quietly, letting that sink in. She wasn't the kind of woman who celebrated someone losing their job, but justice had to mean something. I understand, she said finally. And your training programs? The culture shift? Rachel's tone softened. We're implementing mandatory diversity and bias training for every frontline employee. And Senator, if you're willing, we'd be honored if you helped us shape that program. Margaret allowed herself a rare, tired smile. I'll think about it, but you're off to a good start. As she hung up the call, Margaret stared out her office window at the Capitol dome, its white stone gleaming under the DC sun. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person of color who'd been made to feel small, unwelcome, or invisible. Not today, not anymore. Rachel's voice came through the phone, steady but heavy. Senator Harris, after our internal investigation, I wanted you to hear the outcome directly from me. Margaret Harris, sitting in her Senate office overlooking Washington, D.C., leaned back and waited. Rachel took a steady breath. We reviewed the flight crew's full statements. We also pulled prior records on both Victoria Matthews and Stephen Barnes. There were multiple complaints, repeated instances of rudeness and unprofessional conduct, several of which raised concerns about bias. Margaret's jaw tightened. I'm not surprised. Rachel continued, their behavior toward you, Senator, violated several core policies, especially those tied to discrimination and harassment. The facts were clear, and the witnesses backed up everything you described. There was a pause before Rachel delivered the final blow. Effective immediately, Victoria Matthews and Stephen Barnes have both been terminated. This was not a decision made lightly, but their conduct was blatant, inexcusable, and left us no choice. Margaret sat in silence for a moment, processing it. She had never found satisfaction in seeing someone lose their job, but she understood that sometimes accountability demanded hard consequences. I appreciate the swift action, Rachel, Margaret finally replied, her voice calm but firm. I hope this sends a clear message, not just inside Atlantic Wings Airlines, but to the entire industry. Discrimination has no place in your company or anywhere else. Rachel didn't argue. It does, Senator. And beyond this, we're rolling out mandatory refresher training on diversity, equity, and inclusion for all customer-facing staff. That program starts next week. Margaret's brows lifted slightly at that. Good. Because this issue isn't just about me, it's about the larger, often silent problem of implicit bias. That's exactly what we're focused on addressing, Rachel added, her tone carrying a hint of optimism. And, Senator Harris, if you're willing, we'd love to have your input as we shape the curriculum. Your perspective would be invaluable. Margaret gave a tight smile, even though Rachel couldn't see it over the phone. I'll consider it. Thank you for the update. They exchanged a few more words before the call ended, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. For a moment, she simply stared out the window at the city she had worked so hard to serve. The irony of it all struck her. Had Victoria and Stephen simply done their jobs with basic courtesy and professionalism, none of this would have happened. But their prejudice, their smug assumptions, had escalated a routine flight into a national headline. And now they were out of jobs. Their actions had forced their employer to reckon with its own culture. Margaret felt no triumph in their termination, but she couldn't deny there was a certain satisfaction in seeing that real consequences had followed their behavior. It wasn't just justice, it was a lesson. The final wave of karma landed just days later when local news stations ran an interview with a tearful Victoria Matthews. Her eyes red, her voice shaking, she stammered into the camera. I never meant to be racist. I assumed she couldn't afford first class. The backlash was swift and brutal. Social media lit up with fiery commentary. Thousands of people shared the video, dissecting every word, every excuse, and the consensus was clear. That's exactly the problem. Those assumptions. People pointed out what Margaret had always known. This wasn't about a single interaction. It was about a system that too often judged people by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. Through it all, Margaret stayed focused on her legislative work. She had no interest in gloating or dragging the airline through further public humiliation. Her fight had never been personal. It had always been about fairness, about justice. Still, in quiet moments, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief that the matter had been settled, and settled firmly. Some stories take flight in ways you never expect. For Senator Margaret Harris, what began as a routine trip from Detroit to Washington, D.C., turned into a powerful reminder that prejudice can lurk in the most ordinary places: an airport terminal, a boarding line, a first-class cabin. And while her quiet resolve and, yes, her powerful credentials had delivered swift accountability, the story was never just about her. It was bigger than one confrontation. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that businesses and individuals alike must check their biases, spoken and unspoken. That dignity is not earned by titles or wealth. It is owed to every human being. We must stand up against discrimination wherever it hides, whether it's loud and aggressive or quiet and insidious. Because every traveler, be they a senator or a school teacher, a CEO or a janitor, deserves the same respect. In the end, Margaret did what she had always done. She faced injustice head-on and refused to shrink beneath it. Not because she was a senator, but because she was right. At the heart of this story lies a powerful reminder. Respect should never be conditional. It shouldn't depend on someone's title, wealth, or the clothes they wear. Whether it's a U.S. senator or an everyday citizen just trying to get home, every person deserves to be treated with dignity. Prejudice doesn't always scream. It often whispers in the form of assumptions, side glances, or dismissive tones. And those moments, as small as they might seem, reveal far more about the person delivering them than the one receiving them. What happened to Senator Margaret Harris wasn't just an isolated incident. It's something many people face daily, often without the power or platform to fight back. How many times have people been judged at first glance because of their skin color, their appearance, or the simple fact that they didn't look like they belonged? This story forces us to confront that uncomfortable truth, but it also shows the strength of grace under fire. Senator Harris didn't explode or return hate with hate. She stood firm, demanded accountability, and used her voice, not just for herself, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel small. In the end, the very people who mocked her were forced to face the consequences of their actions, not because she wanted revenge, but because sometimes change only happens when people are forced to see the damage they've done. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this story, it's this: never underestimate the quiet figure in the corner. Power doesn't always wear a badge or shout the loudest. Sometimes it's the calmest voice in the room that leaves the most lasting impact. And more importantly, never let your assumptions rob someone else of the respect they deserve. We owe it to ourselves and to others to check our biases, to slow down, and to choose kindness, even when no one's watching. Thank you for watching and listening to this story unfold. If this message resonates with you, if you believe in standing up against discrimination and fighting for fairness, I invite you to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? How did you handle it? Let's talk about it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, true tales of justice, karma, and powerful life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Together, by sharing these stories, we become part of something bigger, a community that values empathy, respect, and accountability. Let's keep spreading these messages and make sure that no one ever forgets. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no exceptions.